In today's world where new games are released every day and every week there are hundreds of new early access things on Steam, game makers and game designers are constantly trying to find that new thing or the new experience that they could give to the player who's playing their game. Now, whereas in the past this was often done by introducing new gameplay elements, having a gameplay differently than all of your other competitors, lately a lot of studios have been embracing the creation of tightly knit and engrossing narrative stories, which they incorporate into their games, that can provide entertainment unlike any other form of media out there, giving you that gripping emotional story of a book or a movie with the interactivity of a video game. But what are all the things that go into crafting an interesting and gripping narrative in a game? How do you make it so your players don't get bored of the story and simply ignoring it, focusing on the gameplay and finishing the game without having the experience that you aimed for? Today I'm gonna go over the basics of crafting and creating a narrative for a video game. I'm gonna touch up on the conceptualizing, I'm gonna touch up on the narrative goal of a story, how to feed it to the player, and we're gonna go over a whole bunch of do's and don'ts when it comes to designing and crafting that storyline that your players will get to go through. Anyways, with that out of the way, grab your lore book, get ready to listen to some journal entries, and let's go. And obviously, to start us off, not all games need narrative, and just because you're working on a game does not necessarily mean you should already be crafting a wiki page with lore dumps for it. Some games are perfectly fine not having a story. If you're making a new Tetris or pinball game, there's absolutely no need to have an overarching storyline of aliens attacking the Earth. But if you found yourself developing a game that you know will need and you want to give a good storyline, you need to start with the conceptualizing. Now this goes for most games, and that is that you should not develop the gameplay around the story. If you do this, you're already limiting yourself in terms of what the player can actually do in the game by a great deal, and you might just end up with a game that not only has a mediocre story, but also doesn't play good, which is definitely not what you want. Now there are exceptions to these rules, and those are most often the games you would call interactive movies, such as Detroit Become Human, where there is actually very little gameplay. It's rather just the player pushing a button every now and then to guide the story in a certain direction, but today we're not going to be focusing on those. So you're working on gameplay. First things first, let's make sure it doesn't contradict what the story is telling you. If your main protagonist is supposed to be a good guy, don't have him go on a murdering spree and run over hundreds of civilians on the sidewalk when driving a car. It is often the contradictions between the gameplay and the story that can take any player out of the experience and remind them that they're still just playing a game with several closed gameplay loops that they need to get through to get the story moving forward. Now you need to make sure you have understood and established a strong narrative goal. Linking it back to the previous example, don't just create small gameplay sections with a big overarching abstract story that's always somewhere in the background that the players just tend to ignore, taking on the mentality of, I just want to get through this and then I can get the story to move on a little bit. It shouldn't be that the player is accomplishing gameplay tasks and then rewarded with a bit of story at the end. It should be in fact that the player's actions should directly be linked to the story and should help it emerge. A good way to do this is keeping the player in narrative mode with short-term goals. Now these can involve anything, but most commonly they would separate into three categories, that being either a mystery, an uncomfortable environment, or a character conflict. Now each of these would allow you to approach the story a little bit differently. In a mystery environment, let's say you're solving a crime, and you get all these mysterious clues and mysterious people that you need to talk to popping out of everywhere. An often used tool to break the pace of a game is exactly introducing a mysterious short goal. For example, the main character suddenly getting a knock on the door from an unknown person, or a call on the phone from an unknown number. As far as uncomfortable environment goes, this is often present in games such as Tomb Raider, where your character is cast into an environment where they're clearly not doing too well, and your immediate direct goal is to get out of there. Then your short-term narrative goals become starting a fire, hunting some prey to eat, and eliminating the dangers that surround you, for example wolves. As far as character conflict goes, that is most common in games such as The Walking Dead, where there is a larger cast of characters that you need to interact with, that each have their underlying motivations and conflicts in between each other and with the main protagonist. Now that you've established what the goal of your game is and what's the story that you want to tell, you need to actually get to feeding the story to the player. And starting off, the player needs a reason to be curious. Introduce something that is unique, that gives the player a sense of exploration or a sense of mystery, something that they can uncover and that they want to uncover as the story progresses. As I already mentioned before, the player actions should lead to the story slowly uncovering itself. Don't just give it to the player in a big block. Story fragment utilization is extremely important. There are many ways that you can feed small hints and slivers of what's actually going on in the overarching story to the player while they're working on their shorter term narrative goals. It's also important here to mention that you should never lore dump. Don't rely on long audio logs or endless journal entries that the player has to go through to get an idea of what's going on. These would also include dialogue written like things that a normal person wouldn't say just to fit a lot of data into it, or reading texts that are written like a Wikipedia page. Too many dates or too much direct information will lead to player disinterest and will have the opposite goal of what you're trying to achieve in your game. Instead, a good way to provide these story fragments is, for example, in dialogue or subtones. Notice how in games like The Witcher 3 or The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, just by walking around the environment and listening to people talk, you can get an idea of what's going on in that particular area. Also, when having direct dialogue with an NPC, the tone of their voice, if voice acted, or the way they structure their sentences can be a good insight into the morale or the social hierarchy of that person you're talking to. On this point, you should also never forget about environmental clues. A big chunk of the narrative design happens with how the levels are structured, what the textures are like, what the lighting is like, what the audio design is like. What other effects are there applied to the player? Is there a grainy effect over the screen? Is there constant mist or dust surrounding everything? Some of the best narrative experiences that are out there can be games that have not a single word of written or spoken dialogue in them. It's all experienced through what happens to the main protagonist and the environments they get to explore. And obviously this links us to the final point that I want to make, and that is that you should absolutely utilize player learning and experiences into your narrative that you construct. Remember that a big chunk of the story and of the overall game happens in the player's imagination. A good horror game is a good horror game because not every corner has a monster lurking around it. In some situations, it is okay to trust the player to make a logical leap. However, you should definitely not rely on this too much, as you might simply create a story that makes no sense, immediately pulls the player out of the narrative, and gets them back into the short-term gameplay loop, which is exactly what you don't want to do. Also, on the same note, be wary of the so-called Chekhov's gun dramatic principle, which states that every element of a story should be necessary, and irrelevant elements should be removed. As put by A.P. Chekhov himself, if in the first act you have hung a pistol on the wall, then in the following one it should be fired. Otherwise, don't put it there. Now, of course, this is not saying that you can never mislead the player a little bit with the actions that are happening to, for example, further shroud your overall narrative goal and mystery. It says that you should avoid dumping them and introducing them to information that are not relevant to their story and that will detract from the overall experience that you're trying to make for them. Anyways, that is it for what I was trying to say. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Of course, remember that if you're out there crafting your own game, you should most definitely be creative. Don't let your creativity be stopped by some random guy on the internet or by some articles, because who knows? There are constantly new concepts in gaming being developed, and maybe a year or two from now, I'll be sitting here talking about a new concept that you revolutionize. If you enjoyed the video, maybe consider leaving a like, commenting, or subscribing. All of those would be very much appreciated. I want to wish you guys a beautiful rest off today, and I'm gonna see you in whatever next video I make. Bye bye.